Hello, everyone. Welcome to Wall Street from Main Street podcast. My name is Mo Daoud, and today's special guest is a new guest that we brought on. His name is Nick Giambruno. He is the senior editor of International Man. Nick, thank you for joining me.
Oh, glad to be here.
So, Nick, for people that don't know who you are, just give us a background of where you are and where you're from and what you do.
Sure. I am the senior editor of Doug Casey's International Man site. That site has its origins in Doug Casey's first book. And if you don't know who Doug Casey is, he is a contrarian investor and commentator. And he's written a couple of best-selling books. Crisis Investing was one of them, and another one was International Man. So basically, the website that I run is a continuation of that book, of the theme and the mission of that book. And the mission of that book is to help people diversify politically around the world. And what that means is you don't want to be dependent absolutely on any single country. So when you live that way and structure your life that way, it's really like I think of it as like an insurance policy against an out-of-control government. And it also opens up, it's not just a defensive strategy, it opens up the whole world to you for different investment opportunities. So it's really just about making the most of your personal freedom and financial opportunity around the world. And, you know, this discusses things like investing internationally, getting multiple citizenships and passports, acquiring residency in other countries, and so forth. And it's just developing this mindset of how you can really divorce yourself from being tied down to any single country.
So how did you end up getting this gig? So, because you work for Doug Casey, so how did you able to get this job? And because Doug Casey, we met him a few times. He's the type of guy, he likes to meet new people. And as you told me before this podcast, you guys met in Lebanon.
Yes, that's correct. I had been reading Doug's work for many years, and in, I think it was 2010 or 2011, at that point I was working at an investment bank in Beirut in Lebanon. And just to back up a little bit, the reason I was working there is because I had gone over to the American University of Beirut to study when I was in college. And the American University of Beirut is really a world-class institution, one of the few places in the entire Middle East where the credits will transfer back to U.S. universities. And I'd always had an interest in the Middle East. So that is how I decided to study there. And I liked it so much that I decided to move there one day. And I had been working, and while I moved there, I obtained a job with a investment bank, a regional investment bank focused on Middle East equities. And just so happened Doug Casey put out in one of his newsletters that he was going to be in Beirut one day and asked if he had any readers that wanted to get a cup of coffee. So I replied to the email, not thinking that anything would come of it. But sure enough, Doug replied too, and we were able to meet up. And one thing led to another, and that is how I got started with the internationalman.com site.
Yeah, and Beirut is one of the few civilized areas in the Middle East. Not many areas in the Middle East like Beirut where you could actually settle down.
No, it's interesting. It definitely the average person has a total misconception of what Beirut is like. Really, it is. It has what surprises a lot of people is that it has like a legendary nightlife, and it's a fun place to, there's lots of bars and restaurants and nightclubs and that kind of stuff, and beaches. It's really not what people think of when they think of the Middle East. A lot of people would always, say, well, Nick, isn't there a desert in Lebanon? Aren't you sick of the desert? And I was like, there's not really any desert in Lebanon. There's mountains and beaches and that kind of stuff. So the average person has a total misconception of what Lebanon is like. And that's not that surprising, given the amount of propaganda that's, pumped into their heads with the media and so forth on the Middle East in general.
Right, yeah, I agree. I think Lebanon is more, if you compare it to another country, it's more like Italy. It's a lot of hills, a lot of olive trees, a lot of little villages there. So it's a nice little, neat little area in the Middle East.
Yeah, I would agree.
So let's shift gears here and talk about what's going on in the economy. Now, part of your job is that you travel outside the U.S. to a lot of countries. So I want to ask you, since you've done a lot of traveling, have you noticed a slowdown in the economy in other countries, especially in emerging markets?
Well, I'll give you an example. I was recently in Colombia, and you would think, well, Colombia, first of all, has had their currency just decimated in the past year. I don't know the exact figure off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure it's down more than 40% against the U.S. dollar. Now, this is all because of oil, because one of the main exports of Colombia is oil, of course, and oil is down. But it's really not necessarily the case in Colombia that the economy is down. It's maybe it's an outlier. Certainly, there are other emerging markets like Brazil that has serious problems. But Colombia is actually another one of those places that's very misunderstood, not that much different than Lebanon. But Colombia is one of the few places I know of in the world, and like I said, maybe it's an exception. The middle class has more than doubled in size in the past 10 years, and I think that's always a good indication, is the momentum and the direction of the middle class, where it's going. Yeah, the middle class might be bigger on an absolute basis in the U.S., but it's shrinking in the U.S., and that definitely tells you something about a country, about the direction the middle class is going. But Colombia, it might be absolute number smaller, but that number is growing very fast, and that is a very healthy sign, in my opinion. So Colombia is one of the few places where around the world where I see growth potential, and this is also because you look at what's going on in the conflict, and it's the longest running war in the Western Hemisphere. I think it goes back to the late 50s or 60s, and that war is winding down, and I'm pretty sure that war will come to a definitive end in the next few months here. So there are some very positive catalysts for Colombia. But other countries, other emerging countries, do look like they have some serious problems ahead. I mentioned Brazil. I think Brazil is due for some serious economic problems. If you look at Brazil, in the past 75 years, they've totally destroyed their currency, and I mean hyperinflation. Just completely destroyed their currency 5 times. That's an average of about a currency collapse every 15 years. And if you look at the last one, it happened in 1994. So just based on that, it looks like Brazil is overdue for some economic problems. But besides that, you see they have serious political problems. They're in their worst economic downturn since the 1930s. So I think Brazil is due for a collapse at some point in the near future.
And yeah, and they're about to host the Olympics this summer, so bad timing.
Bad timing indeed.
Yeah, and I agree with what you're saying with Colombia. When people think of Colombia, they think of Pablo Escobar and cocaine.
Yeah, they do, but that's obviously a very short-sighted view of the country, and there's just so much more to it. And really, that was back in the 80s and early 90s. It's a completely different situation today.
Yeah, and I know quite a few people that moved from the U.S. to Central America, like Colombia and Panama as well.
Yeah, and there's huge benefits to doing that too. Not just in terms of higher quality of life and lower cost of living. There's potentially you can have tax benefits too. So yeah, I'm all for people going to the countries where they can most realize their financial and personal ambitions.
So I don't know where you traveled lately, but what about the Asian countries like China and Japan? I don't know if you've gone there lately and seen what's been going on there.
Well, I have a chance to go to China and Hong Kong and Singapore in the next few months, so I haven't been there. So I will reserve judgment on those places until I really, get a boots on the ground feel for what's going on. China, I think is interesting. I've written about their new Silk Road project, and I personally think China is in for some tough times, but I'm not one of those who thinks China is absolutely going to collapse. I think they'll have some economic problems, but I don't think it's going to be as existential or so forth as some others have been predicting. I think China's new Silk Road project, which if your listeners aren't familiar, it's what they're basically trying to do is turn the fundamentals of geopolitics of the past 100 years on its head, and they're going to do that by building land-based infrastructure that connects. So they're able to basically trade with Europe without having to go through the oceans and ship stuff in container ships. And of course, who controls the oceans is the U.S. Navy, and they don't like that. So basically, they want to build a system where they can trade with the rest of Eurasia without having to ask the U.S. Navy for permission, which is really what the situation amounts to now. So I think that is a huge positive long term. This is a longer term project for China, maybe 5 to 10 years, but I certainly think that it's something that doesn't get enough coverage in the media and should get more.
I agree. I think China is going to slow down for the next few years, but I don't think they're going to completely collapse. I mean, because they do central planning economics, like in the U.S., they're going to be boom and bust in their economy. And right now, their economy is about to go through a bust. But that doesn't mean it's the end of their economy, because eventually they'll be the number one economic country in the world.
Yeah.
So I want to also talk about the effect currency war is having on people in other countries such as Japan, China. We mentioned Brazil and Russia. Right now, there's a race to debase their own currency in effort to enhance their export market and, increase their GDP and try to pop up the economy and stimulate it. And you have exposures traveling all over the world. What effect is that having on the people out there, outside of the U.S.?
Well, let me just say, I think the whole idea of currency wars is just idiocy. I think the whole concept of a fiat money system is idiocy. There couldn't really be this kind of a currency war that happens right now if it weren't for the fiat money system. If we were an honest money system and gold and silver, you wouldn't really have these kinds of currency wars. But anyways, of course it doesn't benefit the average person in these countries to have their savings devalued. I mean, it's just ridiculous that this has somehow become a mainstream economic notion that currency depreciation and inflation are good things. I think this is a mass psychosis, and the sooner that people snap out of it, I just can't believe that they've been able to convince people that, watch your savings lose value and watch, how your grocery bill is more expensive, and that's a good thing for you. They've convinced a lot of people that that's a good thing. I think it's terrible, and I think the sooner it ends, the better.
Yeah, and they're taught that some inflation is good for you and deflation is bad for the economy, which I don't think that is true. I think deflation is good for the economy.
Oh, I agree completely. Deflation. One of the reasons governments don't like deflation is because it's not as easy for them to tax. So, for example, if there's inflation and like you have some assets and they increase in price and you sell it, well, that's a capital gain. It doesn't really work the other way for deflation, or like your money. Your money is worth more, so they don't get to tax that, and the governments don't like it. And also, it's they like it. It's not good for them because they're debtors, and they don't like that because it makes their debt harder to service. So it's just a completely perverted situation where you have governments insisting that inflation is to the benefit of the common man, which is completely ridiculous.
Yeah, and deflation does not benefit the government as well, because right now we're going through a wealth effect where a lot of the money from working middle class is transferring from their pocket into the government so they can fund stupid programs that we all don't need and bail out the banks and go to war that completely unnecessary, and etc.
Oh, yeah, and inflation helps that process.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And having a Federal Reserve that can print lots of money.
Exactly.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Deflation is something that's actually good for the economy. And if you look at the history, the source of inflation has always come from government and not from free market or capitalism. So inflation is something that government has always created, if you look back in history.
Oh, sure. Inflation is always a political phenomenon. It's comes from the government manipulating the currency and printing more currency units. That's where actually this is another thing where we have to keep our, I think one thing that's important is that we always agree on what the words we're talking about, the definitions of these words, because if we don't agree, not just me and you, I'm talking about in general, that if we don't have an agreement on what these words mean, then quite literally we don't know what we're talking about. So inflation, for example, the classical definition of inflation is simply an increase in the money supply. This is inflation. When the money supply is increased, that's inflation. Now, that's not how it's described today. Today they say rising prices is inflation, but that's the consequence of inflation, not the actual inflation itself. And it's an important distinction.
Yeah, and your definition that you just told everybody is the Austrian economic definition of inflation, which is an increase in money supply.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah, and I agree. And and inflation is the symptom of. The rising prices is the symptom of inflation.
Exactly.
Very, very different definition there, and a lot of people have it mixed up.
They do, and I think there's maybe more of a sinister motive behind this, because when they talk about because the average person, it confuses where inflation comes from. When they say, "Oh, inflation is rising prices," it confuses, because then the average person thinks, "Oh, inflation is the fault of the butcher, the baker, or the candlestick maker," when it's really the fault of the central bank and the government. So I think that the government likes to push this definition, not just the government, but their crony economists like Paul Krugman and these Keynesians. They like to push this definition of inflation because it confuses, to the average person, the source of the inflation.
Yeah, I agree. So let's talk about what's happening in the U.S. and the economy there. Recently, there's been a lot of talk of doing negative interest rate from the Federal Reserve. And as you know, Japan already implemented a negative interest rate. So I want to talk about what does that mean for the people on Main Street in the U.S. if they do implement negative interest rate, and how can they protect themselves? And take a step back. What does negative interest rate mean?
Okay, first of all, this is another just another totally insane policy. And if you ask me, it reflects how desperate they are that they would even consider negative interest rates, and they are considering negative interest rates. The Fed has mentioned it and said they're discussing it. Negative interest rates is another example of this Keynesian idiocy that thinks that we need to stimulate the economy by incentivizing people to spend. So how are they going to incentivize people to spend? Well, they're going to make it so that the money you have in a bank, instead of earning an interest rate and accumulating interest, being paid interest to put your money in a bank, well, you're going to actually be penalized for that instead. So what is that going to do? Well, why watch your money just lose value? So you would want to go out and spend it. That's the idea behind negative interest rates. And I think it's just ludicrous, but it shows, and it hasn't worked. Europe, several European countries have had negative interest rates for a while now, and it hasn't, to the extent that it doesn't stimulate people going out and spending money. It makes them want to find other ways to save money. So it's just complete economic idiocy in all regards. But also there's another disturbing aspect of negative interest rates, because there comes a point where you can only set interest rates so negative where the people find that it doesn't make sense to have money in the bank anymore. It makes, say if interest rates are negative 5%, why would anybody keep money in the bank in that situation? A lot of people would just withdraw the money and put it under their mattress, and then they would not lose 5% each year. And that compounds a lot. 5% each year, or whatever percent negative interest rate each year, that can add up over a long time. But the reason that there's a sort of a bound, a limit on how far negative interest rates can go at this moment is because if they go too negative, people will simply take money out of the bank and withdraw it as cash. Well, the economic central planners have a solution for this, and that is the war on cash that they've been waging now for a long time. But now it's really going into overdrive, and it's going parabolic. So what that means is they've been making it more difficult to use cash. And in some places, Sweden in particular, Sweden is nearly the world's first cashless society, and that is very disturbing on many levels of where they're going with this.
And Sweden is a total socialist country too.
Yes.
And I think that's what some of the current presidential candidates want to mirror the economy. They want to mirror the economy to what's going on in Sweden, and that's a disaster.
It is a disaster, and it's, unfortunately, the country, and this is another reason why we advocate at internationalman.com to be diversified, because if you look at the situation in the U.S. and in a lot of other places around the world, to the extent that the average person wants change, they generally want more government, whether it's more welfare or more warfare, and that's not good. That's not good for your personal freedom. That's not good for your financial freedom and financial opportunities. So the solution to this is to make sure you're internationally diversified and not tied down to one country.
Yeah, and that's very important because a lot of the 1%, that's what they do with their assets. They don't have all their assets in one country. I mean, Warren Buffett doesn't have all his billions of dollars in one bank account at Wells Fargo. He has it spread out.
Yeah, he does. And it's an interesting point is that you don't need to be a billionaire to do this. So you can open up a bank account in the Caribbean. You can open up a bank account or a brokerage account in like Singapore or Hong Kong. You can do that from your living room, and you don't need to go anywhere, and it doesn't take more than a couple of $100s to do it. So anybody can do these things. And if you have, I think a good thing to get, of course, for everybody is another citizenship. You should have as many citizenships and passports as possible, because this just gives you so many more opportunities around the world and so forth.
Yeah, I still have my Jordanian citizenship, but I don't know if I want to go back there.
Yeah. Well, I think the more the merrier, but there are other places where you can get it. Panama, Uruguay, Paraguay are easy ones. It depends, too, of your ancestry. So, for example, I was born in the U.S., but I have Italian heritage, so I was able to get Italian citizenship. It's an individualized thing for everybody. It's no one-size-fits-all, but there are different approaches, and it's a very valuable thing to have, in my opinion.
I agree. So, what do people on Main Street should be doing right now with their assets to protect themselves from the seas of their government and to protect their wealth as well?
Well, I think it goes back to what we've been talking about. I'm a big fan of having hard assets diversified internationally, whether that's holding some gold physical gold internationally, and you can do these in many places where you can have a vault, a private vault, a non-bank institution that will vault your precious metals, or whether it's in international real estate, or just physical cash, given what's going on in the financial markets. If there's some sort of crash and the banks aren't open or a bank holiday, it's good to have physical. I'm a big fan of physical hard assets and internationally diversified.
Yeah, and so you're talking about gold and silver and maybe even real estate outside the country.
Outside of the U.S., yeah, real estate is, the nice thing about international real estate is that it's impossible really for the U.S. government or any government to seize it from you or confiscate it from you. That's not true of other assets. International real estate, though, is basically your government is not going to be able to confiscate it. So I kind of view real estate too as the new Swiss bank account, because another consequence of all these governments going bankrupt and trying to squeeze as much money out of their citizens as possible is they've completely killed financial privacy. Financial privacy does not exist anymore unless unless you take certain steps and so forth. But for most people, in most practical cases, it's dead. But if you have certain hard assets like an apartment or something, this can effectively function as a bank account for you, an offshore bank account. So I'm a big fan of that as well.
So how hard is it for U.S. citizens to go outside the country and buy real estate? Is that something that's difficult, or there's a lot of hurdles to overcome?
Not necessarily. It's totally doable. What you need to do is, of course, it's a very personalized decision. I'd recommend that wherever you choose to buy or look to buy, and there are places. What's interesting too is that a lot of countries around the world, they don't have as big of a mortgage market as the U.S. does, but that's a good thing, because the mortgage, they don't have all these people who are buying because they're able to load up on debt. This actually keeps the prices a little more reasonable in other places in South America and so forth. So what you need to do, what I would recommend you do, is you find a place that you also enjoy spending time in. So it's not a purely investment decision, it's also a lifestyle decision. So you can use this asset even if the investment doesn't turn out to be the greatest investment. You still have a place to go. Say the situation in the U.S. deteriorates and you want to have kind of an escape hatch. You have that. You have that as well too. And when you're not there, you can rent it out and potentially generate an income stream in foreign currency, which further diversifies you. So I think if you can afford it, it's really a good thing to have.
Now, a couple of years ago, the U.S. government passed FATCA, and basically, since they passed that law, I've seen articles that it's become difficult for U.S. citizens to open up a bank account in a foreign country because of all the paperwork, and it's become a hassle to the foreign bank. So now they're turning away U.S. citizens. So I wanted to get your insight on that, and how difficult is it to open a bank account in a foreign country?
Yes, it has become more difficult because of this ridiculous law called FATCA. But it's not impossible. There are still a number of options. Options are smaller, and I think they're getting smaller. But I think it is important that you do this before your options have become completely eliminated. And what that might happen is that the U.S. might follow the path that many other countries have done in the past, and that is impose capital controls, which basically means it's illegal or very expensive and difficult to transfer money out of the country. This is not a surprise. If you look at countries that get into financial trouble, Greece, Cyprus, Argentina, Venezuela, Iceland, these are just some examples off the top of my head. When they get into the trouble, they make it illegal for their citizens to take money out of the country. Well, there's a reason for that. It's because they want to steal that money, and that's the every country that gets into this situation will consider these steps, and the U.S. is no different. And that's one of the reasons. And this is also what FATCA is doing. They are closing the number of options that you have, and they're clearly moving in this direction, that they want to limit the average person's ability to diversify internationally. And it makes total sense. It's because they want to keep all that wealth in the U.S. so they can tax it or otherwise confiscate it. So I think that puts a premium on time and getting your assets outside of the U.S. and diversified as soon as you can. And FATCA, it really is a terrible law, and really the only country in the world that could impose such a terrible law is the U.S. Because what they did is they basically blackmailed every bank in the world and said, you better give us the financial information on all of the U.S. citizens you have as clients, or you're effectively going to be kicked out of the U.S. dollar system. Now, most banks can't. I mean, the way it works right now, if the dollar is the world's reserve currency, most banks need access to the U.S. dollar. So it was an effective threat. But if, for example, a country like Mexico tried to do their own version of FATCA, nobody would listen to it. They would think it's a joke. They'd be, okay, so what? Kick us out of the peso. We don't care. But the dollar, unfortunately, still holds that weight, and that gives the U.S. political leverage, which they, of course, use as much as possible.
And and a lot of grumbling from government regarding people that want to move their assets and open bank accounts outside the country just to avoid paying taxes, which they call it immoral. Where I don't see how it's immoral for people to move their assets so they can pay less taxes to give it to people that's going to use that money on things that not even necessary, like wars, bailout banks, and all these programs that's really not needed.
Yes, well, the thing is that I agree with you. I think you don't want to break any laws, but nobody wants to pay more in taxes than they are legally entitled or legally obligated to, and they shouldn't. I mean, anything less is like giving a tip to the tax collector, and you don't want to give a tip to the tax collector. But what you do when you diversify internationally, yeah, sometimes there can be some tax benefits to the of course, legal tax benefits to that. But the most important thing is that it gives you asset protection, and it makes it harder for those assets to be confiscated or otherwise forcibly repatriated. That's the main benefit here.
Right. Well, we're seeing a lot of corporations move their headquarters outside the country just to save in taxes, and I don't blame them for doing that. There's nothing evil or wrong with doing that. If I was CEO, I'd have done the same thing.
Yes, and the real villains here are not these corporations. The real villains are the politicians who make the tax rates so high that they force these companies to move outside of the U.S. in order to remain competitive. I mean, it's completely predictable, and the people who should be the villains in this story are the people who make the taxes in the U.S. some of the highest tax rates in the world. Those are the people who deserve the condemnation.
And yeah, and the U.S. has the highest corporate tax in the world, and there's talks about making it even higher. So.
I know it's true, and it's unfortunate, but that's the way the political winds are blowing. And generally, it's not surprising because when countries get into financial hardship, usually the people demand, like we were saying before, they demand more government, they demand more welfare, and they'll demand, warfare, and that's, what we're going to get as the country gets more financially desperate.
So people want to move out of the U.S., and we get that question a lot. What country do you prefer and why?
Well, one thing I'd say before I get to that is that you don't for the strategies we've been talking about, you don't necessarily need to move out. You can stay in the U.S. and still be diversified. You don't need to move out of the U.S. to get a foreign bank account, to invest in real estate, to get a passport. It's nice to have those things, and you can still live in the U.S. And if you need to leave the U.S. because there's some sort of, emergency or it's just become unbearable to live here, yes, you have that option to leave at a moment's notice, and that's a good thing. But if you decide to leave, there's a number of options around the world. I personally like South America. For a number of reasons. First, it generally stays out of the idiocy of the wars that are going on in the Middle East and other parts of the world. I like, in particular, Argentina. Argentina stayed out of both world wars and is generally not interested in getting involved in any other war. It has a very agreeable culture for North Americans. It's really interesting because most of the people who are Argentines are of Italian and Spanish and other European descent. It's really like a European country in South America. It's not really, doesn't feel like other countries in South America, like Ecuador or Bolivia, for example. So you have a very low cost of living there and a very high quality of life. So Argentina is good. I also like Colombia. Colombia is really interesting. So those are some places. Of course, it's a very personalized decision. You have the whole world as your buffet, so you can go around and find different places that suit your needs. But those are just couple of my favorite places.
Yeah, any country except maybe Venezuela and Brazil right now in South America.
Yeah, you'll want to avoid those places.
Yeah. Well, Nick, thank you for your time. If people want to find out more about what you do, where can they go?
They can go to internationalman.com.
Okay, great, Nick. Well, thank you for coming on, and maybe we could bring you back on after you go visit the Asian countries and give us your insight on what's going on there.
Yep, sounds great, Mo. Thank you for having me.